Hi gang, so in this video I wanted to talk about something that I've recently seen on my Instagram feed, and that is the Nomad Cosmetics Shanghai palette controversy. A little bit about myself. I am Singaporean Chinese. I've lived there for most of my life, and I only moved to Germany in, I want to say, 2016. If you don't know about Singapore, it is a country in Southeast Asia, and we were colonized by the British, and then we gained our independence. A short history is that British travelers came across Singapore and decided that it would be a great trading port for the purposes of business, especially because of the trading of tea and spices from India and China. And Singapore just was a little bit more convenient of a route. When the trading really started to kick off, plenty of immigrants from mainland China, as well as from India and other parts of the world, came to Singapore in order to become traders and, make their money essentially. So that's the short history lesson, so to speak. And you will kind of understand why I've brought this up as I continue into the video. I also wanted to bring up a few points that may be relevant to you. I have never been to mainland China. However, I am ethnically Chinese. I do also have some Peranakan and Javanese heritage, but I am predominantly ethnically Chinese. Second point I want to make is that I have never been to America. I have visited places like the UK, and like I said, I have been living in Germany for quite a while. So if you have no idea about this particular happening in the beauty space, essentially Nomad Cosmetics released something called the Shanghai palette. The founders are this couple, Felicia and Auntie. According to their website, they have lived all over the US and Europe and traveled to over 70 countries and are inspired by every trip. Most of their products are inspired by locations from around the world. From what I can understand from the Twitter threads, the Shanghai palette received a lot of criticism from Asian Americans. Please correct me if I'm wrong in the comments below. This is from what I understand from reading the Twitter threads. So this first came to my attention on Friday evening, when a friend of mine, Kat, hi Kat, she posted in her Instagram story about this, some sort of discussion about the Shanghai palette. And so I asked her, what's going on? So I looked into it a little bit, but didn't think that much of it. I thought it was going to blow over perhaps. And then today when I was scrolling through Instagram, I saw that Nomad Cosmetics announced that they were going to stop selling the Shanghai palette on their website. So a lot of my information that I'm looking at is from a Twitter user called Chili Beans. So Chili Beans was talking about how people in the Chinese American community were talking about this palette as being a form of cultural appropriation. And the main arguments for saying that it is cultural appropriation is, number one, there is this yin-yang design, which is very much based in, I guess, Chinese philosophy. The criticism there is that the yin-yang symbol is very reductionist of Chinese culture and is not, very representative of Chinese culture. And to support this, there were some screenshots of someone quoting a post-colonial scholar called Edward Said. Just to give you some extra information that might be relevant to this topic, I have a diploma in mass communications, and that was when I was studying in Singapore. I also did a bachelor's in psychology and sociology, and my lecturers were predominantly American. Fast forward to 2016, I started my master's in sociology. I have not completed my master's yet. That story is for another time. So this person brings up some concepts of Orientalism by the scholar Edward Said. He was a founder of post-colonial studies. So let me just read you the quote that was included in this image. And this is by Lil Panning. So Orientalism is when white people go to other countries and other cultures to quote unquote study them, make artwork about them, write books, etc., etc. But because it's done through the white lens, the people/culture they refer to become othered, in quotes, and suffer stereotypes made about them, even if intentions are well-meaning. The impact is that it mystifies the heightened culture, injects magic, and in many past cases has claimed that such cultures are vulgar and inferior to white Western cultures. This is a colonialist, imperialist viewpoint. Chinese culture has been a huge target of white scholars for centuries, as well as many others. Edward Said explains this so much more and goes way more into detail, so I really do recommend reading his book for further understanding. And another factor that I think plays into this, in the past month or so, there has been race-based violence in the US, specifically against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. So let me just read you something from what Chili Beans said. So the owners of the brand are white. It did not sit right with me to see white people profiting off of not only a culture that isn't theirs and Lunar New Year, but during a time when the Asian American Pacific Islander community is facing such a high increase in violence due to racism and the pandemic. Okay, so I think what Chili Beans is alluding to is COVID-19 originated in Wuhan, China, and therefore other Americans seem to be blaming the Chinese American community for the rise of the pandemic and the hardship that everyone seems to be suffering at this point. When criticism of the Shanghai palette increased, Nomad Cosmetics made kind of indirect excuses, talking about how they, with the help of their Chinese colleagues, they created this palette, and giving this origin story of how this palette came to be, because their niece is part Chinese. I think she's multiracial. She wanted makeup which was inspired by her maternal grandfather from Ireland, and also from her father's side, she wanted something that represented her Chinese heritage. This palette was released during the Lunar New Year. Chili Beans was saying that, oh, because the owners are white, they should not be profiting from this. Another big point that Chili Beans raised is that people can be racially insensitive without having the intention to be racially insensitive. So that kind of sums up the thread. All right, so here are my thoughts on the whole issue. First of all, when I first saw the Shanghai palette, I didn't have an issue with it. I thought it looked fine. Yin Yang, okay, yes, it's a little bit tiresome that yin yang is always brought up when it is in relation to Chinese culture, but I didn't mind it. I thought it was fine. Like I mentioned, I've never been to Shanghai. I've never been to China. But from what I saw in the palette, I didn't see anything that struck me as very inaccurate. Then again, my Mandarin is very poor, and yeah, I don't know the main attractions of Shanghai. First of all, I think this fallout happened because Nomad Cosmetics wasn't really sure how to respond to such a kind of social media backlash. As far as I can tell, they did do a decent amount of research and in creating the palette. So I can understand that if they do have Chinese colleagues that are telling them that this is appropriate, this is representative of Chinese culture, and people from mainland China itself, Shanghai itself, have said this seems very appropriate and representative of Shanghai, and then they receive comments from perhaps Asian Americans who perhaps have a different worldview. With every launch, someone has something to say about it. When it comes to cultural appropriation, it's a very sensitive topic, but it's also very, very complicated. And even though, usually these kind of criticisms are taken a little bit more seriously and have a little bit more weight, what is the threshold before I can say, okay, there is really a problem. There is a significant amount of the community that has an issue with this particular palette. If it's just one person that says it, it might not be an issue. 5 people may not be an issue. I think what they tried to do, which was to provide some sort of evidence that they had actually tried to do their research when it came to creating the palette with people from China and people who live in Shanghai. I personally don't think that there was anything very egregious about their behavior. Chili Beans was saying how Nomad Cosmetics responded by thank you for bringing this to our attention, but not really saying much else. And from my standpoint, I think they were trying to take a step back to assess whether this grievance was from a specific group that have perhaps an outlying opinion, as opposed to a majority of people of Chinese heritage having that same opinion. That's not to say that if this other Chinese person has a grievance that is not shared by a majority of people in his or her community, that it's not something to be taken seriously. I think that they were just trying to figure out, okay, is this in fact just a very, very small fraction of the community? And in that sense, is it justified that we continue selling the palette for the people that actually belong to the community and don't find it a problem? Don't belong to the community and don't find it a problem. Secondly, and this can be a touchy issue because, again, I have never visited the US. I am in contact with some American people, and I do know some Asian Americans. My identity and my understanding and my cultural awareness and my ideological mindset is definitely different from theirs. I think some Asian Americans, because in recent weeks they have been subject to this racial-based violence and this general environment of hostility, that any sort of possible impropriety is amplified. If you're Asian American, I would definitely like to know your thoughts on this. I know from my experience coming to Germany as a non-German speaker and looking clearly East Asian as I do, I've been very hyper vigilant of some of the happenings around me. And that's probably because I come from a country where I am part of the ethnic majority. In Singapore, people have been raising the issue of something called Chinese privilege specifically, because Singapore is not just made up of ethnic Chinese, of course. There are other ethnicities that reside in Singapore. The indigenous people are not Chinese. They are Malay. So I can't speak to a lifelong experience of being a minority in the country that I grew up in. And I also cannot speak to a lifelong experience of, fear of race-based violence. I can speak to a fear of gender-based violence, but not race-based violence. But I did notice a stark difference in, when I came here, how alert I was to, comments or perhaps laughter from a group of people that I didn't know. Were they looking at me? Were they laughing at me specifically? Were they making fun of me? And I have had instances where I have been confronted with, people bowing to me and saying konnichiwa or whatever, because of how I look, and then laughing at me behind my back when I just looked at them in complete astonishment. So, and here's my stance on cultural appropriation. I do acknowledge that there are communities that are very much immersed in their own cultural traditions. However, because people are becoming increasingly transient, especially in today's modern world, I personally think it's harder and harder to definitively lay claim to any specific culture. I come from Chinese ancestors. I present as ethnically Chinese. I do have cultural traditions that I adhere to. When it comes to, my philosophy on yin and yang, I also do believe in some of that. But I can't say that I know very much about Chinese history. I don't speak Mandarin fluently. I don't speak any of my other Chinese dialects fluently. My father is Hokkien, my mother is Teochew, but I can't speak either of those dialects fluently. I don't have extensive knowledge about Chinese culture. Some of the Chinese traditions and cultures I actively reject because ideologically I feel that some of it is sexist, or I just disagree with the need to conform to some of these traditions. In all fairness, I think Nomad Cosmetics did a decent enough job with the Shanghai palette. Yeah, I don't think they misrepresented the culture. I think they did do their due research. And just because they're white, I don't think they should be, not allowed to profit from a culture that is not theirs. Because I don't think profit should only be limited to people who are born into a specific culture. And when it comes to things like fashion and art and makeup, things that have an element of creativity to it, things that have an element of interpretation to it, and drawing inspiration from imagery and colors and concepts. When it comes to things like design and art, there's only so much originality you can have. Everything that we build is built on something else. Everything that we create is inspired by something else. If the person takes their time to understand a culture and to do their research, properly do their research about the culture or the specific location, Shanghai for instance, if they've done that and they've made it accessible to people who would not have otherwise come across it, I don't think they are wrong for profiting from it. I honestly don't think this would have happened if tensions were not this high in the US. That is not to say that Chinese Americans who have an issue with this product, their feelings are not valid. I personally just don't agree with it because we are becoming increasingly transient. And there are more interracial relationships, interethnic relationships. Children will have multiple identities and multiple cultures. I think we're running the risk of having a very sterile mainstream culture, which has no flavor, where every brand is just afraid of touching anything that has to do with a culture of a specific community that either the owners are not part of or the main shareholders are not part of, something along those lines. I actually think it's important to include the visibility of various cultures. And like I said, if it's researched well enough and if it's not misinformed, if it's not an overt caricature, if there is an intention to honor culture, if there is an intention to educate, and if there's minimal exploitation involved, because I think to a certain extent every company out there is a level of exploitation. I mean, if we're talking about eyeshadow, Mica is in there. If we're talking about handphones, Mica is in there. And I will link a video down below about mica mining. It's forced labor, it's slave labor to obtain mica, which is in almost everything that we have. At the same time, I think that, right now there is this emphasis on supporting minority-owned makeup brands, specifically in the beauty space. And I personally think that's very encouraging and a very positive move forward in the industry. With that being said, I don't think we should be limiting the production and the profiting of products that are inspired by certain cultures to the people that were born into the culture. If the company does their due research and there is minimal exploitation in terms of production and also in the generation of the ideas, people are compensated fairly for their time, then I don't see any problem with profiting. I'm trying to be a realist about this. I think if we are so hyper vigilant that everything has to be scrutinized and the owners have to be of this race to be able to do a palette based on this culture, then we're going to just descend into complete and utter erasure of any sort of awareness, because we're all mixing. We're all mixing, we're all transient. I personally didn't see an issue with the Shanghai palette. If you saw an issue and you are of Chinese heritage, let me know down in the comments below what you found wrong with it. Also, if you are from Shanghai, I think that would be a great place to start. If you are from Shanghai and, you know, looking at the names of the palette, looking at the design of the palette, what do you think about it? Do you think it's representative enough? Do you think it was researched well enough? Please let me know in the comments, and I'm totally open to having a discussion. If you come from America, let me know your thoughts down below. I know Emmy sometimes watches my videos. Hi, Emmy. She's Native American, and she has a very in-depth perspective when it comes to cultural appropriation, and I would love to know your thoughts, Emmy. So thanks for watching. That's it from me, and ciao for now.